As scientists around the world study historic and prehistoric cultural resources, they unlock information that helps us better understand our past. Unfortunately, in Clark County, our cultural resources are disappearing faster than the scientists can study them. And if we don't do something to stop the loss of our cultural resources, we may lose the key to understanding those who came before us. The question is, how do we protect the cultural resources here in Clark County? Well, the first thing we can do is learn how to recognize them. To learn about the people who came before us, we come to museums like the Lost City Museum here in Clark County. Over the years, scientists, known as archaeologists, study human history and prehistory by excavating places where humans once lived. The reason we're visiting the Lost City Museum is because, unlike other museums that simply display history, this museum is located on a historic site.
This is one of the actual site locations, and it was excavated in the 1930s, and then in the 1980s they built this wing of the museum over it. And it allows us an excellent opportunity to sort of show the process of archaeology and the interpretation that comes at the end of our discovery.
And this area here is reconstructed to look like the original foundation.
This is the interpretation. After the archaeology is done, we go through analysis of artifacts, and then the final step is this interpretation of the best idea that we can come up with as to what this might have been like when the people were living here 1,000 years ago.
And you've recreated it faithfully, like there was probably a ring under there that led you to believe that that was a fire circle.
Hearths are usually in this area, have a little clay rim. It's reddened underneath because of the fire, and that's maybe what they were looking like.
And then right over here, you have the actual dig still left over.
This is where the archaeologist would finish the excavation. Everything is cleaned, the artifacts are collected, it's swept away, and this is pretty much the end of an excavation right here.
This isn't what we would see were we just going out in the desert.
No, you wouldn't see this.
And over here, we have basically what the archaeologists would have seen when they first came upon the site.
This is what the archaeologist looks for, and what we're looking at here are a few artifacts in the sand. You might not see very much, but bits of pottery, chipped stone, and those kind of items give us a clue that there might be something a little more here.
So as we travel through the desert, we're looking for this. We're trying not to disturb areas like this for fear that we will disturb what could eventually be another archaeological find.
Yeah, the first clue that you might see are a few pieces of pottery, and if you recognize those, then you need to start being very careful about where you're stepping and look for other things. The point is that everything in place tells us a story, and everything disturbed is information lost.
In order to recognize pieces of pottery, it helps to know what the original pottery looked like. Here at the Lost City Museum, you'll get a chance to recognize not just pottery shards, but actual pottery found here in Clark County.
These are some of the different types of pottery that we might see out on a site. Most of what we'll see will be little tiny pieces. These are some pretty good sized pieces that give us an idea of the decoration and the color of the pottery. Very rarely do we ever, even in excavation, find a whole pot now. Most of that day is gone, but it's really exciting to be in the museum and be able to see the whole vessel.
There are some things you might see. You've actually got a mano and a metate down here.
We might be able to see a little bit of this ground stone, a mano or metate, or a fragment of that. These are not quite as portable as pottery sherds, and people tend to leave them.
So what we're seeing inside the museum is collected in the area, brought here only because it was part of an archaeological dig. Otherwise, everything would be left where it is.
Even as an archaeologist, if I'm not working on a project, I leave the artifacts where they are, because where they are later on in the excavation tells a lot about the site itself. So if it's not part of my project, it stays where it is.
The archaeological site preserved inside the museum is only a portion of the ancient site that covers the better part of the museum property. Outside, we have an opportunity to see what an archaeologist would find were they to dig under the sand here and other places in the area. Now, if you dig under the sand that we saw in there, basically this is what you would find, right?
Right. These are the foundations as exposed, and this is pretty typical of probably a later era Pueblo house unit. So you never know, though, what's under the sand until you actually start to work with the artifacts and actually expose the foundations and the floors of these houses.
So this actually, this is not a recreation. This is actually a foundation you excavated right on this site here.
This was actually excavated very early, but it is an actual foundation, and much like this, it's what we see when we first discover a site. You clear away the sand, you don't always know what you're going to find under it. You have an idea from the artifacts and the things that you're seeing. But until you get down and actually expose the walls and the floors, and then you get a sense of how the people were solving their problems, what they were doing here.
And of course, you're an interpretive museum, so you've taken this basis and you've recreated the pueblos that actually would be on this site.
Right. As good as we think, a lot of the archaeologists, when they see things, the interpretation, we do have to use a little bit of our imagination. Of course, there are no standing pueblos left. These were made of stone and mud, and through the hundreds and thousands of years, they melted away. So mostly what we find here are just these foundations and sometimes pieces of low walls. These were actually built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1935 as a part of the interpretation of the excavations they were doing then. So they were looking at what they were finding and then recreated these in what they thought these pueblos would have looked like. So it's kind of exciting to stand here and look out across the same scene that people were looking at maybe 1,000 years ago.
And the attention to detail is quite good. Inside, we actually see what they would have looked like inside. And don't you even have a wall that's kind of partially revealed?
Right, and you'll be able to see that. You can see how the sticks were laying down and the stone and the mud. It's really kind of an intriguing building process. And if you think about getting the materials and bringing them here, they had to have water, so that came from the valley floor. It was a bit of a process.
The recreation is absolutely spectacular. I mean, inside, outside, they've done a great job, but we're not going to expect to see this out in the wild.
No.
There's nothing like this.
No. What we'll see are usually just rock alignments, things that sort of line up that don't line up like that in nature. So that's really the first clue that you have a house foundation or some sort of a structure.